What if the Canadian coins in your collection are hiding a story, and possibly a surprising collector value? From the 1952 to 2002 Canadian 1-cent penny to the 1867 to 2017 Canadian 10-cent coin, these small pieces of metal witness decades of Canadian history, changing monarchs, designs, and minting eras. But here's the real question. Which dates, conditions, or rare errors could make these ordinary-looking coins worth a second look? Stay with us, because one tiny detail could change everything. What if I told you that a tiny Canadian 1-cent coin, produced across 5 decades, could be hiding a story far more interesting than its face value suggests? The Canadian 1-cent coin from 1952 to 2002 passed through major changes in Canadian history, different monarchs, design details, and countless years of production. And some examples can be much more interesting to collectors than an ordinary penny. The 1952 Canadian 1-cent is especially fascinating because it belongs to the final years of King George VI's reign. Turn the coin over, and you'll see the famous maple leaf design that became one of the most recognizable symbols on Canadian cents. These early coins can attract collectors when they have strong details, original surfaces, or unusual minting characteristics. Then came a major historical transition. In 1953, Queen Elizabeth II appeared on Canadian coins, beginning a new era that would continue for decades. From the 1950s through the 1960s, Canadian 1-cent coins were produced in huge numbers, but that doesn't mean every example is worthless. Condition, rarity, date, and especially unusual errors can dramatically change collector interest. By the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, the Canadian penny had become one of the most familiar coins in everyday life. Millions were spent, saved in jars, dropped into drawers, and eventually forgotten. But here's the exciting part. Coins that look ordinary at first glance can sometimes deserve a much closer inspection. Look carefully at the date, the lettering, the maple leaves, and the overall condition. Check for double details, unusual strikes, missing design elements, or other mint errors. Even if your coin is not rare, a well-preserved example can still be attractive to collectors. And then we reach 2002, a year near the end of this era of Canadian 1-cent collecting. The penny continued its familiar maple leaf design, but its long journey was approaching a historic turning point. So before you throw an old Canadian 1-cent coin into a jar or spend it without a second thought, take a closer look. A 1952 to 2002 Canadian penny may be small, but it represents 5 decades of Canadian history, and the right coin in the right condition with the right variety or error could be far more interesting than you expect. Because sometimes the coins we ignore are exactly the ones worth examining twice. What if a tiny Canadian 10-cent coin could take you on a journey through 150 years of Canadian history? From the birth of Confederation in 1867 to the historic 150th anniversary in 2017, Canadian 10-cent coins have changed in design, metal, monarch, and meaning. And some examples can be far more interesting to collectors than their face value suggests. The story begins in 1867, the year Canada became a confederation. Early Canadian 10-cent coins are especially fascinating because they belong to the Victorian era and feature Queen Victoria. These coins are now over a century old, and their value to collectors can depend heavily on rarity, condition, and the specific date. As the decades passed, Canada entered a new era. King Edward VII appeared on Canadian coinage, followed by King George V. Then came King George VI, and eventually Queen Elizabeth II, creating an incredible timeline of Canadian history right on a small silver-colored coin. But here's where collectors need to pay attention. Not every 10-cent coin from this enormous period is rare. Many dates were produced in large quantities. However, certain low-mintage issues, better-preserved examples, and especially mint errors and varieties can attract serious attention. Look closely at the date, lettering, portrait, and the Bluenose design. Even small differences can sometimes matter. One of the most famous Canadian 10-cent designs features the legendary Bluenose schooner. This ship became one of Canada's most recognizable national symbols, and its image has appeared on the 10-cent coin for generations. Then we reach 2017, a remarkable year marking Canada's 150th anniversary, After 150 years of Canadian history, the 10-cent denomination had become much more than a simple piece of pocket change. So if you find a Canadian 10-cent coin dated anywhere from 1867 to 2017, don't dismiss it just because it says 10 cents. Check the date. Check the condition. Check for varieties and mint errors. Because one tiny Canadian coin can hold 150 years of history, and sometimes a collector story that is worth much more than 10 cents.